This is Glen Coe, probably one of the most stunningly beautiful and iconic parts of Scotland. But if you'd been here on the 13th of February 1692, this place would have looked very, very different. It was winter, so it would have still been dark, and it was cold, very cold, below zero, probably around -10. There could have been snow on the ground, maybe knee deep, difficult to move. These roads wouldn't have been here. And as you stood there in the cold, you might have become aware of a light in the distance, a flickering light in the snow, making the snow around it glow orange. And as you go closer to investigate, you realize it's a person curled up in the snow, slowly freezing to death in the same clothes that they went to bed in that night. And as you stood there for longer and you listened, you then became aware perhaps of gunfire and screaming coming from the glen below. For the last 5 days, I've been walking and camping along the West Highland Way, and a lot of things have gone wrong. But I've also had some incredible experiences, so make sure and check out the full West Highland Way playlist for all those other videos. But today, I'm going to be doing something a little bit different. I'm going to be attempting to walk the final 25 miles from Glen Coe over the Devil's Staircase to Kinlochleven, and then through the mountains to finish in Fort William. It's over a quarter of the total distance in a single day. So to help put in the time, I've decided to tell you all about the worst betrayal in Scottish history. Wasn't, as some have suggested, the absolute butchering of the Scottish accent by Mel Gibson in Braveheart.
I am William Wallace.
Incidentally, some of the scenes were shot quite close to here, but what is widely regarded as the worst and most infamous betrayal in Scottish history was the early morning when a community here of men, women, children, including babies, were brutally butchered by people they had spent the last 12 days offering hospitality to. People they had been having conversations with, chatting with, playing games with, eating with, drinking with, laughing with. After 12 days, in the early hours of the morning, these guests turned on their hosts and began slaughtering them in their beds, an act that coined the term murder under trust. The atrocity that happened here wasn't, as some people have suggested, just the result of a local squabble. It wasn't even arguably just the result of a national squabble. Really, it was more of a side note or a side effect in a much larger story. And that story was the struggle for power and control in Europe. And it's even connected to the events that led to the creation of my home country of Northern Ireland. And in many ways was one of the sparks that led to the history of violence in the place that I call home. This, of course, is the story of the infamous massacre of Glen Coe, and I'm going to tell you that story today as I attempt to complete the final 25 miles of the West Highland Way. In researching this, I listened to about 10 hours of podcasts and videos, and every single one had variations in the story. Not really the details of the massacre. Everybody agrees on those details, but the variation comes in why the massacre happened. I've taken all those podcasts, I found the story that I find the most compelling, and that is the version that I'm going to share with you today. So hope you enjoy it as much as you can enjoy a story about a massacre. That is a weird aspect of human behavior, that we love stories of death, murder, betrayal, and horrible things. What is wrong with us? So the usual suspects for the massacre are people from Clan Campbell, because back then the Highlands were divided up into and controlled by members from different sort of clans that over the years had fought each other, massacred each other, and generally just not got along very well. And the MacDonalds who lived here and who were the victims of the massacre had a little bit of a history of a beef with the Campbells. And the massacre that happened here was carried out by a lot of soldiers who would have been Campbells and under the command of a Campbell. But it wasn't quite as simple as that, because to find out who was really responsible, we have to travel to Europe, and we have to travel to France, where back in the late 1600s, France was the superpower of Europe, led by Louis XIV. And Louis, King Louis, not the one from the Jungle Book, King Louis of France, King Louis XIV of France, had ambitions to sort of conquer as much as Europe as he possibly could. But there was one man who was absolutely determined to not let him do this, and that man was William III of Holland, otherwise known as William of Orange, or if you're from Northern Ireland and depending on your background, you might know him as Good King Billy. But as this story will tell, Billy did some things which were definitely not good. Well, this is unexpected. I just found this little guy walking along the trail, barely moving. And I've noticed he's all covered in ticks. So I'm going to try and get some of them off him. This is why I carry a Swiss Army knife. Well, not for removing ticks from birds, but because I've got a little set of tweezers. Let's see if we can get some of these ticks off this poor guy. I've removed about 15 so far, and there's loads more on them. I've removed as many as I can. There are loads I can't really get off. I'm going to start pulling off its feathers, but okay, little birdie, off you go. There's definitely something wrong with one of its wings. Oh well. Such is nature. Antibacterial wipe. I hate ticks. I hate them so much. Didn't get them all off. So let it go. And hopefully it'll survive. But tick bites are most often fatal for birds. So I don't think it has the best chances. Plus I think it was a fledgling, so it can't even fly yet. So it's probably gone straight back into the grass and immediately got more of them on it. But so maybe I just traumatized the poor thing. But I felt I should do something. Right, back to the massacre. We're about to go and climb the Devil's Staircase, and this is actually a section of the West Highland Way that during the morning of the massacre, additional soldiers were sent this route to join in. So in Europe, we've got Billy against Louis, and Billy doesn't have quite enough armies to defeat Louis, or at least push him back as much as he wants, and perhaps feeling a bit like Billy No Mates, decided it might be useful if he had access to a lot more soldiers. So Billy marries Mary, who just so happens to be the daughter of James II, the current King of England, and she is heir to the throne. So when James pops his clogs, which shouldn't take too long, Mary will inherit the throne and William will become joint regent. And at that point, he has control of one of the most powerful armies in Europe, the English army. He can take them over to Europe and use them to kick Louis's butt. Or so he hoped. So the plan's set in motion. He marries Mary, all's going great, and then the entire thing is completely derailed when a surprise baby appears. That baby is the very, very unexpected son of James II. And because he's a son, even though he's younger, that means his right to the throne supersedes Mary. So William stands to get nothing. So he does what anyone in that situation would do. He and Mary overthrow his father-in-law, kick James II off the throne, and they take over as king and queen in what's known as the Glorious Revolution. It was not so glorious in Scotland because a lot of people weren't happy about it. There was resistance and a lot of people died. The people who resisted in Scotland were known as the Jacobites, which basically comes from the Latin for James. Crucially, most of the people involved in the Jacobite resistance were the Highland clans, including the MacDonalds of Glen Coe. Now, you might think at that time all of Scotland was fairly united, very similar culture, but that's just not the case because there was a big divide between the Lowlanders and the Highlanders. The Lowlanders had a much more modern type society, whereas the Highlanders lived in those clans, and they were sort of viewed as these sort of strange, lawless, weirdo, cattle-raising barbarians who lived up in the hills. So there was always a little bit of a prejudice, even from normal Scots, against the Highlanders. And it has been said of the Highlanders that there can be only one, but the fact is there were quite a lot of them, and if you were going to rule the place, you needed to have them on your side. Look at that view. That is us up the Devil's Staircase, which actually was nowhere near as bad as I thought it was going to be. I thought it was going to be a lot steeper than that. Okay, so the Jacobites. The Jacobites were a particular thorn in the side for William, because it meant that his armies were tied up dealing with all these rebellions. And as bloody and horrible as the Scottish Jacobite rebellion was, the results were much, much worse and much more brutal in Ireland, where the majority of the entire population would have been in support of James II. And this all comes to a head in 1690 at the Battle of the Boyne, when James II sneaks back over to Ireland with the help of some of the French and some other Europeans, and faces William in a field near the River Boyne. And in summary, William defeats James. James flees off to France again, but after William is finished in Ireland, less than 5% of the land there is still under Irish Catholic ownership. And that arguably sets up the chain of events that would eventually lead to the partition of Ireland and the creation of my home country, Northern Ireland. It always amazes me just how much of an impact things that happened hundreds of years ago in the past can have today, and probably a good example of that is just how much emotion that date of 1690 can create today, particularly in Northern Ireland. In places, people will just shout it as an insult, and you'll even find it written on the inside of bathroom stalls. It just has such strong feelings associated with it, both positively and negatively, depending on which side of the political divide you're on. Okay, let's go back to Scotland and find out what happens next after the Jacobite revolt is squashed by William, because William's next steps are to try and get the allegiance of the Highland clans, and he does this in two ways. First of all, he bribes them, he offers them a significant sum of money, and secondly, he threatens them. If they don't sign a pledge of allegiance to him by a certain date, he will rain down death and destruction on them. So most of the clans comply with this and sign the agreement. Whether or not they're sincere about it is another matter. But the chief of the MacDonalds of Glen Coe doesn't sign it straight away, because he's an honourable man and he's previously signed a Pledge of Allegiance to James II. So he wants to be released from that before he would sign another. So he writes a letter to James, who's in France, and tells him, look, can I sign this agreement to William? I won't mean it. I'll cross my fingers behind my back when I sign it. And as soon as you come back as a rightful king, I'll switch sides. But James takes too long to reply, and by the time the chief finally goes to sign it, it's very, very close to the deadline. And then he makes a mistake. He heads north and goes to Fort William to sign it, but when he gets there, he's told, you can't sign it here. It has to be verified by a sheriff, and the nearest sheriff is in Inverary, which is quite a long distance south. So the chief has to turn around, trudge through the winter snows to get to Inverary and sign this agreement, and by the time he gets there, it's past the deadline. He still signs it. It's verified because he has a letter from the authorities in Fort William that said he did try to sign it in time, and it's all accepted. He thinks it's fine, and he heads back to Glen Coe thinking all is well. But it is not. And you'll find out what happens next after I get down to the village of Kinlochleven and have my lunch, because it's exhausting talking. News! This is us almost down into Kinlochleven, where a couple of years ago in 2022 I took part in the Ring of Steel Sky Race, which was running up right around those mountains. Really, really difficult event, very, very different from the West Highland Way. So if you want to see what that looked like actually running up there along ridge lines and past amazing, incredible landscapes, you can go watch that video. I'll link it up here. From here to the finish is about another 14 miles, so I think I'm gonna keep going. I think I can do it, but I'm gonna go and get some food first before telling you the rest of the story, because I'm really hungry. let me show you everything I bought. I didn't have breakfast this morning, and I've worked out to finish this, it's going to take up to 4,000 calories. So I bought an entire 6-pack of Snickers, 8 tortillas, bottle of Fanta, this is food, Y food, tub of hummus, bar of 70% chocolate, and, because I like to be a little fancy, a German style meat and cheese platter. I'm going to eat at least a third of this, if not half of this, right now before starting out. But before I do that, I got to take a look at my feet. I've layered up my socks today. I put these waterproof socks over the top of my wool socks. Is that wet? That feels wet. So this is the foot that's blistered. There we go, look at that. Ugh. Look the way the skin's all folded up and wrinkled there. That is disgusting. I'm gonna wipe it down with this. This is Body Glide. Oh, that really hurts. Ah! Fresh, dry pair of socks. Are they dry? So at this point, it seems that William has got exactly what he wants. The Jacobite rising has been crushed in Ireland. James II has been defeated. He's fled again to France, and the revolt in the Highlands has been crushed, and the clan leaders have pledged allegiance to him. But it seems like William wasn't quite happy, and possibly it's because it maybe seemed a little bit too easy that all these clansmen had signed this pledge of allegiance. Perhaps he quite rightly suspected that many of them didn't really mean it, so he decides he's going to have to set an example, and he's going to have to set an example horrific enough that no other clans will ever consider crossing him and changing their minds. So of course this means they need someone or some people to make an example of, and unfortunately for the MacDonalds of Glen Coe, that ends up being them. And they get chosen for several reasons. Firstly, it's not a particularly big community, maybe 200 families, so 300 to 500 people live scattered throughout the glen. They're not wealthy, they're quite poor, they're not very powerful, but also the MacDonalds had a history of law breaking, of causing trouble, of cattle rustling, and of generally going at rules and regulations. So there's quite a lot of people didn't particularly like them, including quite a lot of the Lowlander Scottish and some of the other Highland clans. Now some have suggested that it was also because William was Protestant and the MacDonalds of Glen Coe were Catholic, but that's not actually necessarily the case. It's actually more likely that the MacDonalds of Glen Coe were Episcopalian Protestants, so they would have actually believed pretty much exactly the same things as William. However, crucially, they weren't William's preferred brand of Protestantism, which was Scottish Presbyterianism. And lastly, if you're going to commit a massacre, you want to make sure you get everyone. And because they lived in Glen Coe, it was a valley that could be shut off from either end to prevent people escaping and ensure the maximum number of casualties. There was, of course, also the fact that the MacDonalds had taken part in the Jacobite uprising previously, so that might have been in the back of William's mind as well. So the reality is that, never mind anything else, the most likely reason the MacDonalds were chosen was simply because they were going to be the easiest to actually massacre and make an example of. At Glencoe Visitor Centre, you can visit a recreation of one of the turf houses that the MacDonalds of Glen Coe would have lived on. It's built with a stone base with turf is piled up on, and then the roof is wooden beams with thatch made from heather on top of it. They would have had a small open fire in the middle of the floor, no chimneys, and low doors to keep as much heat in as possible. And also to warm the houses, they would have quite regularly brought cattle inside. So you can just imagine what the smell would have been like in here. So it really wasn't a luxurious lifestyle. And also what you might realize is that pretty much this entire structure, with the exception of its stone foundations, is incredibly flammable. A plan is then put in motion, and a group of about 100 soldiers are sent into Glen Coe, not to immediately attack as you might think, but surprisingly to go and live in the homes of the community there. And you might think, well, wouldn't they have been really suspicious when all these soldiers turned up? Well, yes, maybe, but there's also the fact that the McDonald's had a little tax problem in that they hadn't been paying their tax. And one of the ways you could pay your tax, or you could make up for unpaid tax, was to house, feed and water soldiers of the government. So this wasn't that particularly unusual. And as well as that, the Highlands had a really, really strong culture of hospitality. There was an idea that you didn't lock your door at night. If a stranger turned up, you took them in, because up there it's a wild area. It's very cold, dangerous in winter. You could die of exposure, and you never know when you could get up into trouble there. So part of the idea was that you offered hospitality to people because you never knew the day when you might need it. Kind of a do unto others as you would have them do to you kind of idea. So the McDonald's, maybe not if quite welcomed the soldiers into their homes, certainly opened the doors and let them in. And a lot of these soldiers were Campbells, and they were led by a Campbell as well. What's interesting is that the soldiers didn't actually know why they were there. They possibly felt that they were just there to maybe keep an eye on the McDonald's in case they get up to no good. They certainly didn't think or weren't aware that in a few days they were going to be expected to turn on their hosts. So for 12 days they quite happily stayed there, enjoyed their host's hospitality, chatted, ate, drank, played games, socialised with, and maybe even started to see some of these people as friends. Just think about it, in winter for 12 days they would have spent most of this time indoors in each other's company. And that continued until orders appeared and the soldiers found out why they were really there. That is me nearly up it. What's going to be the longest climb today. So when William of Orange authorised something terrible to happen to the McDonald's, he didn't necessarily authorise a massacre. He gave really vague instructions. He authorised an act of severity, whatever that means. And it's thought that people further down the chain took advantage of the vagueness to turn it into order for a massacre. And the most of the blame seems to be pointed at Sir John Dalrymple, the Secretary of State. He's a little bit of a Karen. He didn't like people who didn't obey laws, particularly didn't like the McDonald's of Glen Coe, and it's thought that he's the one who came up with the final order. And that final order was at 5 a.m. the soldiers who'd been living there for 12 days with those people were to kill every single man, woman and child that they could find under the age of 70. And that is exactly what they attempted to do the next morning, but it didn't go exactly according to plan. The people of Glen Coe live very much spread out all over the valley, and the massacre did start early enough with different groups of soldiers going from homestead to homestead, finding, killing anybody they could find and setting the homesteads on fire. There's one particularly horrific story of a family who found out the night before what was going to happen, but before they could escape, the soldiers captured them, tied them up, made them sit there all night until morning, until the orders took effect, then took them outside, lined them up against their house and shot them. There's also stories of families at McDonald's being locked inside their houses and the houses set fire with them still inside. All in all, about 40 men, women and children were killed, including the clan leader Alistair MacLean. However, quite a lot of the McDonald's fleeing during the night, probably wearing the clothes they slept in, died out in the freezing cold temperatures in Glen Coe, and that included the elderly wife of the clan chief Alistair MacLean, and it might have been her that you visualised freezing to death in the snow at the start of the video. Now, 40 people dying in a massacre is still absolutely horrific, but the fact is that this was out of a community of potentially up to 500 people. So it wasn't a very effective massacre, and there's several reasons for this. One is that the really bad weather delayed reinforcements coming in who were going to block off the glens from either end to make sure nobody could escape. But also the orders seemed to go out at different times, and the massacre started at different times in different parts of the Glen. In some cases this was because military commanders were just cowards and didn't want to get their hands dirty, so wanted to wait until someone else had done most of the killing before they turned up. But there's also stories of soldiers having a conscience, and after having spent 12 days with people, refused to carry out their orders. And there are other stories of soldiers warning their hosts about what was going to happen and telling them to flee during the night before it would actually happen in the morning. But regardless of how successful it was as a massacre, if you can even make such a statement, the general population in Scotland and in England saw it as a totally non-justifiable an atrocity and demanded that there be an inquiry. It's raining again, but I don't care because I'm gonna finish this today. Now, as you would expect and probably hope, the inquiry came back with the conclusion that the massacre of Glen Coe was an act of unjustifiable, barbaric murder. And the conclusion was that someone was going to have to pay the price for what happened. So the blame for it ended up being firmly put at the feet of Alistair Dalrymple, because of course William wasn't going to take any blame for it. And as a result, and as a consequence of his actions, John Dalrymple suffered the fate of losing his job. That was it. That was all that happened. He lost his job. The man who orchestrated, justified, and gave the final orders for the massacre of 500 people, even though it was unsuccessful, got fired. Which tells you something about just how little value the government, and by the way that included the Scottish government at the time, put on the lives of Scottish Highlanders, because you may be guaranteed if it had been Lowlander Scots who were massacred, the result would have been incredibly different. But the fact is, the consequences of the Glencoe Massacre actually spread right throughout history to the present day. I'm starting to find this quite difficult. I've got at least another 8 miles to go. My legs feel empty. My left foot with a blister is getting more and more painful. I just feel like I can't walk properly. But I'm gonna finish because if I don't finish, I can't tell you the rest of the story, because there's a place down here that I thought would be kind of a good place to finish it, but it's 8 miles away. So yeah, keep going. I have an itchy bum! It's true though. There you go. Enjoy part of my lunch. Sun's out. Ben Nevis, tallest mountain in the UK. We're nearly done. You'll forgive me if I use my phone for this last bit because my head is foggy and I can't remember what I was going to say. But we've all heard the saying that history is written by the victors, and that is entirely true. But popular history, the kind of history that gets made into movies and TV shows, is often written and presented by storytellers. Storytellers who tell it from a certain perspective in order to make it interesting, and often they present things in more black and white terms. The good guys are really good and the bad guys are really bad. Just below me, beyond the caravan site, is an area, a field down there, where scenes from Braveheart were shot. Now, Braveheart is one of those movies, fantastic movie, great story, but a lot of people take it as straight fact, even though it's absolutely chock full of historical inaccuracies. And it's another one of those stories with really clear good guys and bad guys. And the story of the Glencoe Massacre, or at least the story of that area, is a little bit like that. The MacDonalds are almost presented sometimes as these peace-loving, innocent cattle herders who are brutally slaughtered for no reason whatsoever. But the fact is, the MacDonalds had blood on their hands. They'd taken part in rebellions. Historically, they'd been involved in fights with other clans. And in the last few miles of the trail, I even passed a commemorative sign that commemorated a time in battle when the MacDonalds absolutely beat the living daylights out of the Campbells, slaughtered the Campbells, and pursued the Campbells into the hills, killing them as they went. So, shades of grey. But I think the massacre of Glen Coe really captures people's imagination and sense of outrage because of the abuse of hospitality that was involved. There's just something particularly treacherous about murdering people who you've spent the last 12 days living with. And the result? Well, King William is hated in Scotland for the rest of his reign. And I'm told that to this day, there are some MacDonalds who refuse to eat Campbell's soup because of the association. The massacre also leads to a bit of a chain reaction that helps trigger the union of Scotland, England and Wales in 1707 into the United Kingdom of Great Britain. And as for the community in Glen Coe, well, it never really recovered. People moved back into the area, they tried to rebuild, but they'd lost their clan chief, and eventually years later, during the Highland clearances, people were generally removed from the area, and that's an entire other topic in of itself. You can go read up on that. And today, hardly anybody lives in that glen. And finally, also like all historical stories, there's never enough time to tell all details or what happens after. So if you're interested in it, go and read up on it, find it for yourself. I've put a list of a lot of the podcasts I listen to down in the description, as well as a few videos. But I've got another 3 miles to go to finish the West Highland Way. So thanks for coming along with me, and let's just get this done. And if you've enjoyed this video, I've made a whole series on the West Highland Way, starting in day 1 all the way through. I think I made about 6 videos in total. So if you want to get those, I'll put a link to the playlist down in the description. But let's get ourselves down to Fort William and finish these 100 miles.
The end again. It's the end again. The end again. It's the end again.
And then they decided to move the actual ending from there to the middle of town.
Not today. Not today.
This seemed like an appropriate place to come back to and end the video. It is the day after, and I feel absolutely horrible. Absolutely horrible. I was so exhausted when I finished yesterday, and the depressing thing was it was an anticlimax when I finished, because it was the end of the day, all the shops were closed, there weren't many people about, there was like a bin that had been set on fire, and the finish is just a bench with a statue of the man with sore feet on it. I sat down, I took a selfie, and got up, and immediately some tourists sat down and started taking. Nobody cared that what I'd just done, and I just left there standing. Nobody cared. No one cared. Every other time I've done any kind of big physical challenge, it's been an official event. So there's been people cheering at the finish line, and someone puts a medal around my neck. So that didn't happen. So immediately after it was done, it was like, oh, right, well, I'll just walk half a mile back to the van then. And that was it. But I did it, and I looked up afterwards, and in the sort of 5.5 days that I was out, I covered on foot
110 miles on foot, and my total like vertical, like the amount I climbed, equivalent of 14,000 feet. 14,000 feet, which I think is like 4,000 meters. I think it's around 4,000 meters, something like that. So it's done. I have all kinds of thoughts about it that I haven't put together yet. It'll take me a week or two to process it all. But I guess I'll conclude by saying that I loved 75% of it, and I hated about 15% of it. Thank you all for watching this series of videos, and if you only watched this one, go back and have a watch. It actually helped. It really helped knowing that I had people coming along with me, even if they were just future people. It's like I have these future friends who were doing the adventure with me, and that made it all that bit easier. Bye bye.